survival. Stories from around the world, reflecting man's concern for his world. The world of survival.
These are the barren mountains of central Iran. Long ages of wind and sun have sculpted a land of pure desolation. It's hard to imagine a more terrible place than this oven of sun and stone. Yet there is such a place, an island called Hormos. Shaken by earthquakes, scorched by the sun, it has rightly been called the gates of hell. Hormos is an island made almost entirely of salt. The island of Hormos lies 6 miles off the Iranian mainland at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. Almost circular in shape, it's about 5 miles in diameter, rising to 700 feet at its highest point. The Portuguese built this huge fort in the early 1500s. Its purpose was to safeguard their monopoly of the spice route from the East Indies. But the garrison was helpless without fresh water. Practically every drop found on Hormos is saltier than the sea. These cavernous underground chambers were built as an answer to that problem. The whole massive construction underlines the harsh and arid climate of Hormos. This chamber once held more than 2,000 gallons of water, and it was certainly needed. Only a few briny wells supply the islanders, and that water is usually reserved for the goats. Apart from this, the gaunt hills of Hormos produce no fresh water. These jagged peaks are not made of rock. They're the weathered remains of an enormous salt dome pushed through the overlying mantle of rock by the collision of drifting continents. Bursting from the cauldron of the Earth's interior, the salt dragged with it an amazing collection of rocks and crystals, everything from hematite to fool's gold. About 85% of the island is pure salt. Any rain that falls sinks into the rock and rapidly becomes too salty to drink. So it's a mystery how the Hormos gazelle manages to survive. They're quite large antelope. The male stands 2 feet high at the shoulders. Like all gazelle, they're extremely fast. Many desert antelope can exist without much water. They get most of what they need from the plants they eat. But all need some water, especially when feeding their young. Where can the Hormos gazelle possibly find enough fresh water? Local folklore improbably claims that they purify seawater by sucking it up between their hooves. The camera team wondered whether the gazelle knows of a hidden supply somewhere in the hills. There had to be an explanation. Salt-tolerant plants are the only ones capable of surviving here. They jealously guard whatever water their long roots can find by growing stems and leaves covered with a waterproof layer of wax. Another way of reducing water loss is to decrease the size of your leaves. This plant has taken the small leaf strategy to extremes. So has this weird Brussels sprout of a plant. An even more effective survival plan is to reduce the leaves to defensive spines. That way the plant can protect itself from browsing animals and save water. But only a few places are productive enough to support even this sparse vegetation. Most of the island is completely devoid of any kind of life. Hormos seems almost to defy anything to survive on its barren, salty slopes. Inside the island's many caves, there is a deathly stillness. The only things that grow and prosper are the stalactites, and those are completely made of salt. The island makes mock of any attempt at colonization. With fresh water, much more life could thrive on Hormos. Ironically, the island does produce plenty of water. It flows in bubbling streams from the base of the salt hills, yet perversely, it's all completely useless, supersaturated with salt. The streams look almost like alpine torrents, but it's salt that surrounds their margins, not snow. Yet where on earth can this water come from? With temperatures as high as 130 degrees Fahrenheit, the sun evaporates the water, making the streams even saltier. Wherever there's an obstruction, the salt crystallizes in weird coral-like masses. The last thing the camera team expected to find in such conditions was a frog. Yet there it was, a frog, mummified in salt. How did it get there? The tadpole from which it grew couldn't survive without fresh water, nor could the frog spawn. There just had to be a hidden source of fresh water in which the frogs could breed. The salt streams are useless for this purpose. They're 10 times as salty as the sea into which they eventually flow. Even on the seashore, Hormos has a surprise in store. Shoreline deposits of red ochre turn the sea to blood. It may look uninviting, but the seashore is the least inhospitable part of the whole island. Those white, eye-catching flashes are made by tiny fiddler crabs. The male uses his specially enlarged claw as a flag in a crab semaphore system, warning rival males off his territory. A small patch of beach centered on the crab's hole. If an opponent ignores these warnings, the two combatants come to grips, claw against claw, in their own version of Indian wrestling. The trick seems to be to unbalance your opponent and flip him on his back. The males never do each other any lasting damage. The loser's chances of winning a mate simply become more remote. Except for mating battles, the male's large claw is useless. He can't feed with it. He has to rely on his small claw for that. The female has the advantage here with 2 small claws to use as a knife and fork. The male's fighting claw, it can be the left or right one incidentally, gets in the way of the important job of hole digging. A hole is essential for survival. Just before the tide reaches the crab, it cuts a disc of mud. The disc forms the doorway to the hole, trapping an air bubble and allowing the crab to breathe. To make things even more difficult for the male, if he wants to attract the attention of passing females, he's got to keep his big claw clean. A fiddler crab wouldn't last long without a bolt hole. Herons stalk the beach, using their lance-like beaks to vary their diet with a crab or two. fiddler crab's main enemy is a far smaller inhabitant of the island's shoreline. It's a fish, but only just. These little fish spend about as much time out of water as in it. The way the fish scuttles across the mud has given it its popular name, mud skipper. The mud skipper lives and hunts for its food on the tide line that divides the salt sea from the even saltier land. There's nothing it likes better than a tasty fiddler crab. But the fiddler doesn't go down without a fight. Even with a mouth like this, the mud skipper can find crabs a tricky meal to swallow. These mini hippos are well adapted to life on the edge of the sea. They can breathe air, and their pectoral fins are modified not for swimming, but for walking on mud. Each mud skipper needs a patch of shore on which to bask, and is prepared to argue about it. The mud skipper is probably just beginning to evolve from a sea-dwelling to a land-living species. Perhaps if it knew what conditions are like on this island of salt, it wouldn't be so eager to leave the sea. The people of the salt island of Hormos are mainly fishermen, eking out a living in their long, proud dhows. The population is concentrated in a small collection of houses on the east of the island. Everything on Hormos stops at midday. With temperatures of 130 degrees Fahrenheit, there's little to do but seek the shade of the boats. The heat holds sway on Hormos. The houses even have wind towers to catch the breeze, though there's precious little wind about. There's even less fresh water. In fact, it's all imported by this tanker. The whole human population is dependent on this boat for its survival. It arrives in Hormos each day with its precious liquid cargo. The water comes from Bandar Abbas on the mainland, some 15 miles away. It's pumped ashore into a communal storehouse close to the beach. Everyone must pay for and collect his or her own water. There's no piped water anywhere on the island. Each gallon of water is collected with a good deal of back-breaking effort. So it's little wonder the water is used only for absolute essentials. Clothes are washed in the sea. As long as the water tanker arrives each day, the human inhabitants of Hormos are secure. The mystery is, how does the wildlife of Hormos, scanty as it is, survive? Some creatures, like these bees, can steal their water from the human supply. But what about the gazelle, birds, frogs, and a variety of insects? Was there, after all, a hidden freshwater lake somewhere on the island? There had to be some source if they were to survive the blistering heat. There's just one small part of Hormos where life is a little easier, at least for insects. It's called the Kona Forest. Conditions have to be pretty desperate before you can dignify such a sparse collection of gnarled trunks with so grand a title. Each one of these trees is a miniature oasis of shade and moisture for some small creatures. This squat, bush-like tree is well adapted to the arid conditions. Each branch is covered with a defensive array of unpalatable spines. It's a jujube tree. The flowers act as miniature water holes for the bees in this parched salt desert. They provide liquid in the form of nectar. But, as at any other water hole, predators lurk there. For the mantis, the bee is food and drink. Its flesh provides the mantis with all the moisture it needs. The stalk is careful and precise, and the kill swift. Once seized by those long spiked forelegs, the bee is delicately dismembered and eaten. Perched on the very jaws of death is a small black fruit fly. It is attracted by the moisture from the dead bee. A mantis gives no quarter to anything edible, even when it happens to be another mantis. The victim immediately goes limp. Playing possum like this seems to puzzle the attacker. Perhaps the mantis thinks it has grabbed a branch and not an intruder. When it makes the slightest movement, it is dragged from the branch to be eaten. Hormos could do well without locusts. Many get blown here from the mainland. Although a locust can eat its own body weight of leaves in 6 hours, these probably aren't doing much damage to Hormos' already undersized forest. The leaves are so tough, the locusts make little impression on the trees. Ants are the scavengers of this mini oasis. They benefit from the shade and from any debris that falls from the tree. The ants carry anything they can find back to their nest, like this dead locust. Transporting such a weighty food package calls for a group effort. Even then, things can go wrong. But the setback's only minor. The locust's legs are neatly snipped away. Then the headless carcass continues its journey to the ant's nest. The most cunning predator of all lives at the foot of the jujube tree. Each tiny crater is the home of a creature which sets and springs one of the simplest and most effective traps in the animal kingdom. It's the antlion larva. Having dug a crater, the antlion buries itself at the bottom with only its long, caliper-like jaws showing. As soon as an ant enters the pit, the larva catapults a stream of sand at it. If the ant loses its footing and falls to the bottom, the jaws snap shut and the victim is drawn beneath the sand to be eaten. Living beneath a tree causes problems. Twigs and other debris sometimes fall into the carefully laid trap. Most are easily disposed of. But some objects are more difficult. The jujube seed is too heavy to throw out. If it remains in the pit trap, the antlion is going to go hungry. He tries to bulldoze it from the pit, without much success. The antlion's persistence at last pays off. Oh, now it'll have to start all over again. It was a swarm of bees that finally led the camera team to one supply of fresh water. The swarm, taking advantage of the tree's shade, was awaiting the return of scouts sent to discover a site for the nest. Hormos bees usually live deep in the hills. The camera team followed their swarm from the jujube tree to a tiny cave at the base of a salt valley. Inside, the bees were already hard at work nesting. A cave like this is an ideal place on Hormos. The thick walls insulate the bees against both heat and cold. The worker bees helped to solve one of the most puzzling riddles of Hormos. They were clustered round a seepage of water close to the shore, and unbelievably, the water was fresh. Wherever it had come from, it hadn't seeped through any salt yet. The soil above it was the sand of an old shoreline. But this still didn't reveal where the water comes from on an island that gets practically no rainfall each year. Soon after discovery of the bees' supply, the frogs gave away their secret too, though they had given a false clue. The frogs didn't need Hormos water at all. They were getting it all from the mainland, taking an illicit shower in the leaks from the islanders' drinking supply at night. Mind you, this still didn't explain how the frogs reached Hormos in the first place. The basic mystery still remained unsolved. How did Hormos, without rainfall, get all the moisture to fill those salt streams running so copiously to the sea? The answer, when it came, was simple, even blindingly obvious, but totally overlooked. Before leaving, the team collected some rock samples, including one of pure salt. They left them outside overnight. In the morning, there was a pool of salt water where the sample had stood. At night, Hormos is stifled in an atmosphere that has a 90% humidity. Think how a block of kitchen salt soaks up moisture in the air. Well, Hormos is like one large block of kitchen salt. Every night it just absorbs hundreds of gallons of water from the humid air. By a malicious trick, Hormos is probably the most efficient producer of water in the Persian Gulf. Yet, almost every drop is useless to living things. Only a small proportion condenses on rock and remains comparatively fresh. Hormos is a cruel place. Yet, in one way, the few creatures that have solved the problems of living here are exceptionally fortunate. Their life may be harsh, but it seems that there is little chance of them being wiped out by human development. Perhaps the lesson is, if you wish to survive, choose a place to live that mankind doesn't much want.